Hey there, Caleb Wojcik here, and welcome to the new iteration of my podcast called Couch to 500K. This podcast will be an outlet for me to document my journey as an entrepreneur, and I've been making content online since about 2010 when I started my first blog, but I've been a full-time entrepreneur working on my own business, having people work for me, working with clients, building my business online since about 2014. But I've been pretty bad at showing the behind the scenes of what I'm working on. Basically, I'm the exact opposite of what Austin Kleon talks about in Show Your Work. I tend to just, work in private, keep everything to myself, and only kind of pop up on social media to promote something when it's ready to share or launch or sell. And so I've done this with free content like YouTube videos where I just work on them on my own and then release them out into the internet when they're ready, or with paid courses. I'll work on deep in the office, not tell anybody about them. And then, hey, when they're done, I'm like, hey, everyone come buy my thing. Or even with clients, I'll go and shoot on location, doing video production or work on the edit. And I rarely share any of the behind the scenes. But ironically, my most successful launch that I've had all time was the Kickstarter for SwitchPod. And this was actually something that I did share the process of building along the way. And honestly, I think I could have done even more to share what we were building in the prototypes. And then afterward into the manufacturing, I could have even shared more there. And that would have helped that business grow even more. And so I'm going to try to start doing that with SwitchPod. And I'm going to try to start doing that with this too. Because I tend to lurk in the shadows, letting the perfectionism get the best of me, chronically procrastinating and fine-tuning every little thing until it's good enough for other people to see. And I failed to take the document, don't create advice of people like Gary Vaynerchuk. I don't share the behind the scenes, even though, for a movie, I love watching the special features on a Blu-ray or a DVD back when I was a teenager. And I still buy physical copies so I can see the behind the scenes. But yeah, I don't do this myself. So with this new podcast and this new kind of format, I'm trying to be a little bit more open and honest about what's going on with me, what's going on with my business, and share some of the things I'm learning. So I hope you get a few things out of this podcast. I hope you are encouraged by watching someone else in the arena, someone else building multiple businesses, sharing their real struggles of working for themselves, balancing their family life. I have 3 kids now, and what does or doesn't work. So if you're looking to build a business with multiple revenue streams, hopefully this podcast will share a little bit about, how I'm making money from all these different places. I have services. I do a lot of client work with video production and editing. I have physical products now with SwitchPod. I have digital products like courses where I'm teaching stuff. I make money through affiliate marketing, recommending products, sponsorships where people want their product in my videos, advertising from YouTube and other places, and a bunch more. I hope this will help push you out of your comfort zone a little bit and share yourself online like I want to share myself a little bit more. Because I really want to encourage other people like me who tend to just be private introverts and not share what's going on with them. But I want to share the behind the scenes a little bit more. Because some of the most inspirational content for me over the past 15 years has really been when people share real numbers behind their businesses or even their personal lives, like how much money they make, how much they spend, how much they pay in taxes or for their team of employees. And I think it makes talking about money less taboo. So I hope to do more of that with this podcast and with my content going forward. Hence why in the title is $500,000, $500,000. And I'll talk more about that in future episodes. But I plan to experiment more with posting on social media more than I have been, being more open and honest and vulnerable on those platforms too. I'm going to try to do these podcasts in one take. Now, I do have notes I'm looking at, but I'm going to try to do these in one take, have them be a little bit more raw and less produced. So if you're wanting to show up online too a little bit more, I hope this podcast inspires you to do a little bit of the same. Now, a little quick history of my podcasting, because I have been doing podcasts for a while. I have 100 plus episodes of my own podcast under my belt, and I have a lot of episodes when I was on the Fizzle Show or being interviewed on other podcasts. But I do want to talk a little bit about the history of how I've got my podcast to this point, because this isn't episode 1. I'm actually using a podcast feed that already existed from the past episodes I've had over the past 10 years of making podcasts online. So you know how there's the Marvel Cinematic Universe of all the different Avengers movies? There have been these phases, like the first phase is called Assemble. I'm going to get kind of nerdy here for a second. The first phase is called Assemble. It ends when they have the first Avengers movie, but that's after Iron Man and Hulk and Captain America and Thor each get their own movies. Then phase 2, you have Age of Ultron, which brings in Guardians of the Galaxy and Ant-Man. That ends with the second Avengers movie. Then phase 3 was the biggest one where you have Endgame, and that adds in, Doctor Strange, Black Panther, Spider-Man, Captain Marvel. It culminates with the Infinity War and the Endgame movies. And then it keeps going. There's phase 4 with Legacy, and then there's going to be Secret Invasion and so on. And so this podcast is basically like the MCU to me. This is basically all the different phases it's been through. Phase 1 for me was 2012 and 2013 when I worked with Corbett Barr at Think Traffic and Expert Enough and Fizzle. I recorded 24 episodes of the podcast called the Cubicle Renegade Podcast over a year and a half. And that was back when my website was called Pocket Change. And I first was talking about personal finance and kind of shifted to talking about entrepreneurship and how to quit your job, because that's what I was doing. I left my full-time desk job at the Boeing company towards the end of 2011 to work full-time for a blogger. And I was then hoping to eventually work for myself full-time. So I have interviews in that phase of the podcast with James Clear, Gary Vaynerchuk, Chris Guillebeau. And that show is actually a different podcast feed entirely, but those episodes are still live if you search for Cubicle Renegade in your podcast app. Then there'll be phase 2, which was kind of from 2014 to 2016. And this is when I launched the DIY Video Guy podcast. If you scroll back to episode 1 in this podcast feed, all the way down at the bottom, you'll find episodes from nearly 10 years ago. I had just left working at Fizzle to go all in on doing video production full time. And I was also trying to teach how to make better videos on the internet through my website, my podcast, and my YouTube channel. Over the next 2 years, I did 69 different episodes. So it's pretty consistent. That was probably the longest consistency I was doing for podcasts. And there are a lot of interviews with YouTubers and video creators in the archives. There are conversations with creators that were smaller back then, but now have millions of subscribers. People like Thomas Frank, Austin Evans, Amy Landino, Caleb Pike, and others. And then I took a break from the podcast when the amount of downloads were anywhere between 1,000 to 2,500 views on average, which was just not as strong as the views I was getting on my YouTube channel. And I was making more money from my YouTube videos and from video courses, and I had clients to focus on, so I just kind of put the podcast on pause. Then there was phase 3, which was 2018 to 2020. I called this the Caleb Wojcik Show, just named it after myself. It was a little bit more broad. And as I committed to making more YouTube videos and was growing SwitchPod behind the scenes, and that was getting closer to launch, I was connecting with a lot more YouTubers that I wanted to have conversations with. I just wanted to have them recorded. So I just thought I'd get the podcast going again. I played around with filming interviews in person, really cinematically with a clean black background, just two people sitting at a table. And those are some of my favorite episodes I've ever done. I got to chat with Levi Allen, Jason Zook, Kitty Peters, a bunch of other people. We did a 6-person roundtable talk with Matt Diavella, Armando Ferreira, and others in the YouTube space. And then the pandemic hit, and recording in person was a little bit harder, you could say. And I experimented with doing some virtual interviews with Tyler Stallman and Thomas Frank, recording at high quality on both sides over the internet and publishing those both on YouTube and to the audio podcast. And about 30 episodes into this phase, I hit episode 100 on the podcast. And it was just a milestone, and it was late 2020, pandemic burnout and everything. I decided to pause again, focus on the editing client work I was doing, putting a lot of time into SwitchPod to get that product shipped and out the door to people. And the pandemic also made it harder to record interviews in person. So now we're in phase 4. We're going to focus on a little bit more of solo episodes, at least for the beginning, of me sharing my journey of growing my different businesses. I'm going to talk about each of the businesses that I run. I'm going to talk about how they make money, how I've wasted money, that sort of thing. And then we'll eventually start having guests on to talk about different topics related to being an online entrepreneur, being a video creator, and going from there. So whether you're watching this on YouTube or you're just listening to it in a podcast app, I'm excited to have you here. In the next episode, episode 103, I'll share my burnout story, how I basically ended up on the hypothetical couch that I'm alluding to at the title of this podcast, and how I just burnt out completely and tried to figure out what to do next. And this podcast is part of what comes out of that. Then the episode after that, episode 104, I'll break down why I want to try to make $500,000 in revenue each year. It's a lot of money in my brain. Hopefully it's a lot of money for you too, but I'll break down the exact numbers on kind of what we need to live in Southern California as a family of 5, and how do we do that running multiple businesses, and how much money I actually need pre-tax, and having to pay for health insurance and preschool and just living in an expensive part of the world. Kind of want to break down the numbers on part of that and explain why that number is so high. It's more than I have ever made in a year. I've gotten kind of close. I mean, I've had a year of revenue above that, but with way more expenses. So I'll be curious to see where this podcast goes and where I can take the revenue to hopefully reach that goal of $500,000 a year. But it's something to shoot for, and hopefully you have a number in your mind of how much you want to make, and this can help you get there. You can learn a little bit along the way from me and the other people I bring on the podcast, and I hope to see you back each episode. So that's going to be it for now. I'm Caleb Wojcik. Thanks for checking out the podcast, and I will catch you in the next one. Cheers.